Hello and thanks for using TickBoom. In this video I want to walk through an alternative approach to a question that I recently answered, and that was a question that came in two parts. Part one is we had to demonstrate this inequality using charts, and then part two was to show this other inequality making use of what we had shown in part one. So really I'm focused on this part two, this second part, how we can show this inequality. And if you had seen my original video, you would have seen that I ended up getting there, but in quite a convoluted way, making reference to the definition of E, doing a few little hacks with subtracting 1 from a numerator and denominator. It just wasn't a clean approach. And I had a suspicion that there must have been a more elegant way. And interestingly, it was the student who sent through the question that showed me the better way that I'm about to walk through with you. Funnily enough, that student found part one of the question more challenging, and for me, part one is what I found straightforward, and it was part two that I struggled more with. So there you go. What I'll do now is just walk through a much more elegant way to tackle this second part. No need for any fancy techniques. So the key to it is, in starting with this first inequality that we proved in part one, it's much easier if we treat it as two separate inequalities and reevaluate them separately. So if I say this left hand bit is part one and the right hand bit is part two, for part one, well, you may remember that was the relatively easy bit. We can just rearrange, we bring the 1 over, so we get 1 on n plus 1 is less than e to the 1 on n. So n plus 1 on n is less than e to the 1 on n. And that was fairly simple to get this part into the format that we needed for this proof. Now for part two, this is where I stumbled a little. We'll take this right-hand part of the inequality by itself. So we get e to the 1 on n minus 1 is less than e to the 1 on n. And where I went astray was I moved the minus 1 over and went from there. Whereas you get a much simpler path if you decide to multiply both sides by n. So let's do that. So we get n e to the 1 on n minus 1 is less than e to the 1 on n. N e to the 1 on n minus n is less than e to the 1 on n. I'll bring this over and the n over, so we'll get n e to the 1 on n minus e to the 1 on n is less than n. Factor out the e to the 1 on n, and then we get what we're looking for. Much simpler way to go. So it's ironic that you know, the most obvious approach just eluded me. It's almost like the difficulty of part one just meant I couldn't see the simple approach that was available for part two. Very interesting to step back and notice that. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time thinking about this, racking my brain, and this just didn't jump out at me. It was very interesting. But now that we've got that, we can bring it together and we get n plus 1 on n is less than e to the 1 on n, which is less than n on n minus 1. And then it's very simple. We just say let n is equal to 1,000. Then we get 1,001 on 1,000 is less than e to the 1 on 1,000, which is less than 1,000 on 999. So we've demonstrated this inequality. We haven't used a calculator. The question specifically said no calculators. So there you have it, a much more elegant way to go about that proof. So I hope you could follow that, and I hope you found that helpful. And tick boom.